Right, we're going to get into our final post-flop leak. That is when our opponent doesn't utilize the overbet shove play. A lot of players coming over from no limit, it just won't seem very natural to them to 2x pot or 3x pot shove the flop all in. Well, if our opponent doesn't have that play in their arsenal, then they are making some mistakes because of how quickly equities change in this game. And I'm going to go over a few bullet points and ways to exploit those type of players. So first of all, when the villain enters the pot pre-flop, we want to loosen specifically our limping range because we're going to realize more equity against these players post-flop. So the reason why we want to focus on our limping range here that we're expanding is because we actually want stacks to be deeper post-flop relative to the size of the pot, because the big mistake that our opponent's making is when stacks are deep relative to the size of the pot. This is a leak that is specific to having a high pot to stack ratio post-flop. We also want to tighten a little bit our raising behind range. So a couple of the hands that we would have otherwise raised behind, we may now want to just limp for the reason that I just mentioned. We want stacks to be deeper post-flop. Now, it doesn't mean you want to, take, cut off limps and you're on the button with ace-king and we're going to check. No, of course not. We're still going to largely get value from hands, from those type of hands. But I'm just saying, in the instances when it's a hand that you either could limp or call and before you were 50-50 on it, limp or raise and before you were 50-50, well, maybe when one of these players who doesn't know the old overbet shove strategy, when they limp behind, now all of a sudden we want to limp 60% instead of 50%, something like that. And we also want to buy in cash games, of course this doesn't apply in tournaments, to cover this player. Because we want stacks to be as deep as possible. Because if we are in a heads-up pot against this player, and we have the two pair that should be shoved on the flop, as I've pointed out as I do point out in some of the Triton material in this course, for example, I'm going to go over plenty of times when you should be shoving all in on the flop to protect your hand, and on semi-bluffs, and they do not, then we are exploiting them. When we're playing a rat hole type stack against this player, we're not really going to be able to exploit that specific leak. So on the turn, we need to be prepared to shove with semi-bluff that elicit folds from flop two pair or strong top pairs against this type of player specifically. And the reason why is because other type of players, right, when we make it to the turn, these hands might not be in their range because they probably would have just overbet shoved the flop. Whereas against this player, maybe he only is comfortable betting pot or half pot or whatever amount, and we can float the flop. But now, when he checks to us on the turn, we do need to be prepared to try to get him off two pair in this game. Right, so here's a great example. We defended, Queen Jack on the dealer button, and our opponent c-bet this board, and then he checks to us on the turn, right? We can now maybe get a fold from a hand like ace-king or ace-queen, where some players may have just overbet shoved this flop, right? Let's say we started on the flop, let's say we had 1.4 pot bets left. And a lot of players in this game would just overbet shove the flop with a hand like ace-king or ace-queen. We're playing against the opponent who does the old half-pot strategy. So we're able now to call the flop, and now he doesn't have a heart in his hand. He's confused about what to do. He might just check fold this turn spot, and we can profitably shove. Here's another example. If we defended a hand like Queen 10, and it comes King 9-7, our opponent bets the flop and then checks the turn. Here's a spot where he might be wanting to go ahead and fold a hand like ace-king or king-queen. There are a lot of hands that he was very, very comfortable with on the flop, and that on the turn he all of a sudden is a lot less comfortable with. We also are, in general, going to be playing more rivers than normal. So we got to be prepared to turn pairs into bluffs on the river against this type of player, because he's going to have a stronger range, absolute range on the river or a stronger range based on what came on the flop than other players would. We're going to have less information about whether or not this particular player had a set or two pair on the flop. So when those straights do come in, a four-liner, for example, and he checks the river, we need to be ready to turn our pair into a bluff against this type of player and to represent a made straight. So here's an example. We got Jack 10 on the 8-Jack Queen 6-8 board. A lot of times, if our opponent had a hand like Queen 9 or Queen 10, they would normally just overbet shove the flop. Let's say they had 2 pot bets left, and we had defended in the cutoff, and they raised in the hijack. You'd oftentimes see players just shove there. But since this player didn't, and he instead bet the flop, and then let's say he bet half pot on the turn, and we called again, of course, because it's short deck, and we have a lot of equity. We have a pair and a gut shot, right? And we're not looking to fold hands like a pair and a gut shot to a half pot bet. And then the river comes in 8 and he checks. Well, now we got to be ready to go ahead and fire a bluff and try to elicit some folds. Here's a final example. We got Jack 9 on King Queen 6. The board runs out 7-9. So our opponent, bets half pot flop, half pot turn, and normally we would just fold a gutter ball here. But let's say because our opponent's betting so small, we're able to go ahead and peel profitably. River 9, they check. Now we can go ahead and turn our pair of 9s into a bluff. Whereas on this board, against some players, they may opt to go ahead and overbet shove, probably for not 2x pop, but maybe for like 1.3x pop bets, a hand like ace king. Those type of hands. So I hope that you learned a lot about exploiting players both pre-flop and post-flop from the slide I put together. These are some of the more common leaks that no limit hold'em players have when they transition to short deck, and hopefully you'll be able to identify when there's a player who, without even talking to them or knowing their history, of course, just from the way that they play, if they're new to short deck and if they're real strength or backgrounds in no limit hold'em, because you'll be able to recognize them making a couple of these errors.